The morning had been proceeding with the clockwork precision that makes life in the brownstone on West 35th Street bearable, which is to say, it had been proceeding exactly as Nero Wolfe demanded it should proceed. At 9:15, I was in the office, reviewing the bank statements and wondering how a man who never leaves his house can spend so much money on food. Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms with Theodore, conducting his daily communion with 10,000 orchids. Fritz was in the kitchen, preparing what my nose informed me would be something involving veal and mushrooms. The October sun was doing its best to warm the world through our windows, and I was feeling as close to virtuous as a man in my profession ever gets. That's when the doorbell rang with the kind of insistence that suggested trouble wearing expensive shoes. I checked my watch. 9:47. Too early for legitimate business, too late for the postman, and exactly the wrong time to interrupt Wolfe's sacred routine. Through the one-way glass panel in the front door, I could see a woman of perhaps 40, well-dressed in the understated way that costs serious money, clutching a leather briefcase as if it contained the secrets of the universe. I opened the door. "Good morning. Can I help you?" I must see Nero Wolfe immediately. Her voice carried the kind of authority that suggested she was accustomed to having doors opened for her, both literally and figuratively. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I import specialty foods. Someone is trying to destroy my business, and they're using garlic to do it." Now that was a new one. In my years as Wolfe's assistant, I'd heard clients blame everything from jealous spouses to international conspiracies for their troubles, but garlic as a weapon of business destruction was definitely a first. "Miss Vasquez, Mr. Wolfe is currently occupied with his orchids until 11:30, and then he'll be busy with lunch until 1 o'clock. If you'd like to make an appointment, this can't wait." She stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of something that definitely wasn't expensive perfume. It was garlic, but garlic with an undertone that made my nose wrinkle involuntarily. 3 of my restaurant clients have canceled their contracts in the past week. They're saying my garlic smells like death. I studied her face. She had the kind of controlled desperation that comes from watching something you've built over years crumble in days. Her dark eyes held a mixture of anger and fear that suggested she wasn't exaggerating about the urgency. "Come in," I said, stepping back. "Have a seat in the office. I'll see what I can do about getting Mr. Wolfe's attention." She followed me down the hall, her heels clicking on Fritz's immaculate floor. I settled her in the red-leathered chair facing Wolfe's desk and went to consult with Fritz about the mysterious ways of garlic and death. Fritz Brenner looked up from his preparation, where he was dicing shallots with the precision of a surgeon. His round face was flushed from the heat of the stove, and his expression grew thoughtful when I explained our visitor's problem. "Garlic that smells of death." He set down his knife and wiped his hands on his spotless apron. "This is not possible naturally, Archie. Good garlic, it smells of earth and sun and the promise of flavor. If it smells of death..." He shrugged in that particularly expressive way that only the French have mastered. "Someone has made it so." Before I could ask him to elaborate, I heard the familiar rumble of the elevator coming down from the plant rooms. Wolfe's schedule was as immutable as the laws of physics. Down at 11:30, never a minute earlier or later. The fact that our visitor had arrived during his orchid time was going to put him in the kind of mood that made glaciers seem warm and friendly. I heard his footsteps in the hall. He weighs 1/7 of a ton and doesn't try to hide it. And then he appeared in the kitchen doorway. His massive frame filled the space, and his dark eyes, small in his round face, took in the scene with the kind of attention he usually reserved for a particularly rare cattleya. "Archie, Fritz." His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "I understand we have a visitor with aromatic concerns." "Ms. Elena Vasquez," I said. "She imports specialty foods. Says someone is sabotaging her garlic to smell like death, and it's destroying her business." Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. which for him was equivalent to jumping up and down. Death has a smell, Fritz? Oui, Monsieur Wolfe. And if someone has given this smell to garlic? Fritz shook his head gravely. It is an abomination. Wolfe was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on something beyond the kitchen window. I knew that look. He was weighing the case, considering whether it was worth interrupting his carefully ordered day. The fee would certainly be adequate. Miss Vasquez's clothes and briefcase suggested that money was not an object, but Wolfe had been known to turn down wealthy clients if their cases didn't sufficiently engage his intellect. Very well, he said finally. Inform Miss Vasquez that I will see her now, but make it clear that my time before lunch is limited and I have no patience for hysteria. I returned to the office to find our client sitting rigidly in her chair, staring at the wall of books behind Wolfe's desk. She looked up as I entered, and I could see that whatever composure she'd maintained on the doorstep was beginning to show cracks. Mr. Wolfe will see you now, I said, settling behind my desk and pulling out a notebook. He has about 30 minutes before lunch, and he doesn't appreciate drama. She nodded, straightening her shoulders as Wolfe entered the room. He moved to his desk with the deliberate grace of a man who knows exactly how much space he occupies in the world, settled into his custom-made chair, and regarded our visitor with the kind of attention he might give to a particularly interesting specimen. Miss Vasquez, Archie tells me someone has weaponized your garlic. That suggests either remarkable creativity or remarkable malice. Both, I think. Her voice was steady now, but I could see her knuckles were white where she gripped her briefcase. Mr. Wolfe, I've been importing specialty ingredients for 15 years. My reputation is built on quality. I supply some of the finest restaurants in the city. 3 days ago, that reputation began to crumble. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a small glass jar. Even sealed, I could detect that same unpleasant undertone I'd noticed at the door. This is supposed to be premium garlic from a small farm in Provence. It should smell like heaven. Instead, Wolfe leaned forward slightly, which for him was like standing on his head. You suspect deliberate contamination. I'm certain of it. This isn't spoilage, Mr. Wolfe. This is sabotage. Someone has found a way to make my best product smell like a morgue, and they're doing it systematically. First the Provence garlic, then my Spanish varieties. Now even my domestic supplies are affected. Who benefits from your ruin? Wolfe's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it that suggested his interest was engaged. That's what I need you to find out. But I can give you a starting point. My former business partner, Marcus Chen. We dissolved our partnership 6 months ago after disagreements about business practices. He started his own import company immediately afterward. Wolfe's fingers drummed once on his desk blotter, a sure sign that his formidable brain was beginning to work on the problem. Ms. Vasquez, if someone is indeed sabotaging your inventory, they must have access to your warehouse, your suppliers, or your distribution chain. How many people have such access? Too many. She pulled a folded paper from her briefcase. I've made a list. There's Marcus, obviously. My warehouse manager, David Park. 3 of my regular drivers. 2 employees at my main supplier in California. And she hesitated. My assistant, Carmen Rodriguez. She's been with me for 8 years, but she's been acting strangely lately. I was taking notes, but I was also watching Wolfe's face. There was something about this case that had caught his attention beyond the mere novelty of weaponized garlic. Maybe it was the systematic nature of the sabotage, or maybe it was simply the affront to his culinary sensibilities. My fee is $15,000, plus expenses, he said finally. Half in advance. She didn't hesitate. Done. Very well. Archie will require a complete inventory of your affected products, access to your warehouse, and interviews with everyone on your list. I will also need samples of both contaminated and uncontaminated garlic for analysis. You'll come to the warehouse yourself? She asked, sounding surprised. I will not. I conduct my investigations from this office, Miss Vasquez. Archie is my eyes and ears in the field. However, I will examine your samples personally, and I assure you that my palate is more discriminating than any laboratory. She nodded, relief evident in her posture. When can we start? Immediately. Archie will accompany you to your warehouse this afternoon. In the meantime, I suggest you avoid using any of your current inventory and warn your remaining clients about potential contamination. As our client gathered her things and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something important. The systematic nature of the sabotage suggested careful planning and intimate knowledge of her business. But there was something else, something about the way she'd hesitated when mentioning her assistant that made me think we weren't getting the whole story. But then again, in my experience, clients never tell us everything. That's what makes the job interesting. After she left, Wolfe sat quietly for a moment, staring at the sealed jar she'd left on his desk. Finally, he looked up at me. Archie, when you visit Ms. Vasquez's warehouse, pay particular attention to the storage conditions and handling procedures. Also, I want you to obtain samples of garlic from each of her suppliers, both contaminated and clean. You think the sabotage is happening at the source? I think, he said, picking up his current book, that someone has found a way to corrupt the very essence of flavor itself. That suggests either remarkable scientific knowledge or access to specialized equipment, or both. He didn't explain further, and I knew better than to push. But as I prepared for my afternoon expedition, I couldn't help thinking that a case involving the deliberate corruption of food was exactly the kind of thing that would offend Nero Wolfe's deepest sensibilities. And when Wolfe's sensibilities were offended, someone usually ended up regretting it. The garlic might smell of death, but the air in the brownstone had just gained a distinct scent of impending justice. The afternoon sun was doing its best to warm the October air when I arrived at Elena Vasquez's warehouse in Long Island City, but the chill I felt had nothing to do with the weather. The building was a converted factory from the 1920s, solid brick and steel that had been retrofitted with modern loading docks and climate control systems. From the outside, it looked like any other food distribution facility. From the inside, as I was about to discover, it smelled like a crime scene. Elena met me at the main entrance, having traded her morning's business attire for practical work clothes that suggested she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. Her composure had returned since our morning meeting, but I could see the strain around her eyes, the kind that comes from watching something you've built over 15 years crumble in 15 days. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Mr. Goodwin," she said, leading me through the reception area. "I've arranged for you to meet David Park, my warehouse manager, and I've pulled samples of both contaminated and clean inventory for Mr. Wolfe's analysis." The warehouse proper was impressive. 30,000 square feet of carefully organized chaos. Rows of industrial shelving stretched toward a ceiling lined with climate-controlled ducts and security cameras. The air should have been filled with the rich, complex aromas of imported spices and specialty ingredients. Instead, there was an underlying wrongness that made my nose twitch, as if someone had taken the essence of good food and corrupted it with something that belonged in a morgue. "The contaminated inventory is quarantined in the back section," Elena explained, gesturing toward an area sealed off with heavy plastic sheeting. "We've had to isolate nearly 50 cases so far, representing about $30,000 in direct losses, but the real damage is to our reputation." A stocky man in his 50s approached us with the measured gait of someone who'd learned that bad news travels fast in the food business. His handshake was firm, his eyes were intelligent, and when Elena introduced him as David Park, her warehouse manager, I could see why she trusted him with her operation. 20 years in food distribution, he said without preamble, and I've never seen anything like this. The contamination is too systematic to be accidental, too sophisticated to be amateur sabotage. "What makes you so certain?" I asked. pulling out my notebook. David's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over Long Island Sound. Because I know spoilage patterns, Mr. Goodwin. Temperature abuse leaves signatures, soft spots, discoloration, specific bacterial odors. Pest contamination has its own calling cards. This is different. The garlic looks perfect, feels perfect, but smells like death itself. Elena nodded grimly. 3 of our best restaurant clients canceled their contracts within 4 days. The Meridian, Chez Laurent, and Piccolo Mondo. Their chefs wouldn't even let me explain. They just told me not to come back until I'd solved my quality control issues. I made notes while studying the warehouse layout. The security was professional but not paranoid. Cameras at key points, keypad entry systems, clear sight lines to all entrances. But there were also vulnerabilities, a side entrance for employees, a fire exit that might or might not be properly alarmed, and a small office entrance that Elena used for supplier meetings. Who has access to all these entry points? I asked. Myself, David, and Carmen Rodriguez, my assistant, Elena replied. The 3 regular drivers have keys to the loading dock only. She paused, and I caught the hesitation. And Marcus Chen still has a complete set of keys from our partnership days. That was either careless or suspicious. Possibly both. You dissolved a business partnership 6 months ago, but left your former partner with full warehouse access? The dissolution was complicated, Elena said, her voice taking on the careful neutrality that usually means lawyers are involved. There were issues about inventory ownership, supplier contracts, shared equipment. Marcus agreed not to use his keys until everything was legally settled. And you trusted him to honor that agreement. Elena's laugh had all the warmth of a February morning. Marcus Chen is many things, Mr. Goodwin, but he's not a liar about business matters. If he wanted to destroy me, he'd do it in court with depositions and injunctions, not by sneaking around my warehouse with chemical compounds. Before I could respond to that interesting character assessment. David Park cleared his throat with the authority of a man who'd been holding something back. There's something else you should know, he said, glancing at Elena. Carmen Rodriguez has been working unusual hours lately, staying after the warehouse closes, coming in on weekends. Says she's catching up on paperwork, but Carmen's always been efficient during regular hours. Elena's expression tightened. Carmen has been under personal stress. Her mother is ill, medical bills are mounting, and she's been asking for salary advances. I didn't think. And twice in the past 2 weeks, David continued, I found doors unlocked in the morning that should have been secured. Small things. The office entrance, the storage room. Easy to explain as forgetfulness, but you don't buy it, I finished. David shook his head slowly. Carmen's been with us 8 years. She doesn't forget security protocols. And there's something else. She's been asking questions about our supplier schedules, delivery routes, storage procedures. Says she's updating our emergency protocols. But why now? Elena looked genuinely pained. Mr. Goodwin, I can't believe Carmen would betray me. We've built this business together, survived the recession, dealt with impossible suppliers and demanding clients. She's like family, in my experience. Family members often make the most effective enemies because they know exactly where to strike for maximum damage. But I kept that observation to myself and focused on gathering facts. I'll need to examine the contaminated inventory, I said, and I want samples of your labeling materials, storage containers, anything that comes in direct contact with the product. Elena led me toward the quarantine section, and the smell hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was actively wrong, as if someone had taken the fundamental concept of nourishment and perverted it into something obscene. Through the plastic sheeting, I could see cases of what should have been premium garlic from Provence, Spain, and California, all of it looking perfect but radiating an aura of corruption that made my stomach turn. "How many cases total?" I asked, breathing through my mouth. 47 so far, from 6 different suppliers. The contamination seems to be spreading through our entire inventory, but there's no pattern to the timing or the sources. As I collected samples and documented the contaminated products, I found myself thinking about what Wolfe had said that morning. Someone had found a way to corrupt the very essence of flavor itself. But why choose such an elaborate method when there were simpler ways to destroy a business? Unless the point wasn't just destruction, but humiliation. The kind of revenge that required not just malice, but intimate knowledge of what would hurt most. I was sealing the last sample container when Elena's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Carmen. She's supposed to be handling client calls from the office, but she's asking about our meeting schedule for next week." Elena looked up at me. Why would she need to know that? Before I could answer, we heard the sound of a car door slamming in the parking lot, followed by footsteps on the loading dock. David Park appeared in the doorway, looking puzzled. "Elena, there's a man here to see you. Says his name is Marcus Chen, and he has some kind of package for Mr. Wolfe." Elena's face went pale. "Marcus is here? Now." I closed my notebook and checked my watch. In my experience, when suspects start showing up uninvited with packages, it usually means someone is getting nervous about something. And nervous people make mistakes. "Let's go see what Mr. Chen has to say for himself," I said. "This should be interesting." As we walked toward the loading dock, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something important. The systematic nature of the contamination, Carmen's unusual behavior, Marcus Chen's convenient appearance. It all felt too orchestrated, like pieces of a puzzle that had been arranged by someone who wanted us to see only certain patterns. But then again, the best mysteries are always the ones where everyone has something to hide and the truth is usually more complicated than anyone wants to admit. Marcus Chen stood in the warehouse doorway with the casual confidence of a man who had never needed to announce his importance. He was compact and well-dressed, wearing a charcoal suit that suggested success without ostentation. His handshake was firm, his smile was controlled, and when he spoke, there was an undertone that suggested he was accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, extending a manila envelope. "I believe Mr. Wolfe will find this interesting. It concerns Elena's current difficulties." Elena stepped forward, her posture rigid with suspicion. "What are you doing here, Marcus? And how did you know we'd hired an investigator?" "Word travels quickly in our business, Elena. When premium restaurants start canceling contracts, people notice." He glanced around the warehouse with the practiced eye of someone who understood its operations intimately. "As for why I'm here, someone wants me to believe I'm responsible for your contamination problem." He handed me the envelope, which contained a photograph and a small wrapped package. The photograph showed Marcus entering the warehouse through the side entrance, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from across the street. The timestamp indicated it was taken 2 nights ago at 11:23 p.m. The package was wrapped in plain brown paper with a typed label for N. Wolfe, a sample of what's coming next. "Someone called me Tuesday night," Marcus explained, his voice carefully neutral. "Said they had information about Elena's problems and wanted to meet here at midnight. When I arrived, no one was waiting, but obviously someone was watching. You used your keys to enter my warehouse based on an anonymous phone call." Elena's voice carried the kind of controlled fury that suggested their business dissolution had left deeper wounds than either wanted to admit. "I was trying to help, Elena. Whatever our disagreements, I never wanted to see you destroyed." Marcus's composure cracked slightly. "Someone is systematically targeting specialty food importers. You're not the only one. That was information worth pursuing. Other importers are having similar problems. Giuseppe Martinelli in Brooklyn lost 4 restaurant contracts when his olive oil started smelling like sulfur. Rebecca Walsh in Queens had to destroy her entire cheese inventory after it developed what she described as a morgue-like odor. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. David Park, who had been listening with the intensity of a man whose livelihood depended on understanding threats, stepped forward. Mr. Chen, when you entered the warehouse, did you notice anything unusual? Any signs that someone had been in the contaminated storage area? The quarantine section was sealed exactly as it should have been. But I did notice that the office entrance was unlocked, which struck me as odd for a midnight meeting in a warehouse. Before anyone could respond to that interesting detail, we heard footsteps on the loading dock. Through the open bay doors, I could see a young woman approaching with the kind of quick, nervous energy that suggested she was either late for something important or early for something she dreaded. "That's Carmen," Elena said, and there was something in her tone that suggested our conversation was about to become more complicated. Carmen Rodriguez appeared in the doorway moments later, and it was immediately clear that she was both surprised and displeased to find Marcus Chen in her workplace. She was petite, but carried herself with the controlled energy of someone accustomed to managing multiple crises simultaneously. Her dark eyes swept the group, lingering on Marcus with unmistakable hostility. "Elena, what is he doing here?" she demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "Carmen, I thought you were handling client calls from the office." Elena replied, her voice carefully neutral. "I was, until I saw his car in the parking lot." Carmen's attention shifted to me. "You must be the investigator. I hope you're not taking anything he says seriously." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Carmen, you were present during our entire partnership dissolution. Everything was handled legally and professionally." "Legal doesn't mean ethical," she shot back. "And it doesn't mean you wouldn't sabotage Elena's business to eliminate competition." I was taking notes, but I was also watching the dynamics between these 3 people. There were undercurrents here that went beyond simple business relationships, old grievances, personal loyalties, and the kind of intimate knowledge that comes from working closely together. "Ms. Rodriguez," I said, keeping my voice conversational, "I understand you've been working unusual hours lately. Can you tell me about your weekend and evening activities over the past 2 weeks?" Carmen's composure wavered slightly. "I've been staying late to catch up on paperwork. My mother is in the hospital, and I've had to take time off during regular hours for medical appointments. Elena knows about this." "Did you meet Mr. Chen at the Polaris Diner last Thursday evening?" I asked, watching her reaction carefully. "What?" Carmen looked genuinely shocked. "I've never met him anywhere." "Why would I?" Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me a text thread. Someone claiming to be Carmen contacted me from a number I didn't recognize. They offered to sell me information about Elena's operational weaknesses for $500. I declined, but someone matching Carmen's description sat in the diner for over an hour. "That wasn't me," Carmen said, her voice rising slightly. "Elena, you know I would never—" "I know 8 years of you," Elena interrupted, and for the first time I heard real pain in her voice. "But I also know we're drowning, and people do desperate things when they're drowning." David Park cleared his throat with the authority of someone who had been holding back important information. "There's something else. Carmen's access card was used to enter the warehouse after hours on 3 occasions in the past 2 weeks. Each time she said she was updating inventory records or checking on equipment. I unwrapped the package Marcus had brought, using proper evidence handling procedures. Inside was a single bulb of garlic that looked perfect but smelled like a combination of sulfur and decay. Even through the sealed container, the odor was unmistakable. Not natural spoilage, but something that had been deliberately corrupted. "Mr. Park," I said, sealing the sample in an evidence bag, "in your professional opinion, What kind of agent could produce this specific odor profile? David considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Not bacterial or fungal contamination. That would show visual signs. This smells like hydrogen sulfide mixed with organic amines, possibly mercaptans. Someone with chemistry knowledge could create this effect with the right compounds. Carmen took a step toward Elena. I don't know anything about chemistry. I handle paperwork, client relations, and inventory management. If someone is framing me, they're doing it because they know you trust me. Or because you have access to everything that matters, Marcus said quietly. Carmen, you know our supplier schedules, our client lists, our security protocols. If someone wanted to destroy Elena's business systematically, you'd be the perfect inside source. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with the expression of someone who had just realized that trust, like garlic, could be corrupted. Carmen, I need you to give Mr. Goodwin your phone, your access cards, and your passwords. Voluntarily. Carmen nodded, but I caught the quick glance she exchanged with Elena. It was the kind of look that passes between people who share secrets, and in my experience, secrets in a case like this usually turn out to be important. As I prepared to leave with my samples and evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in that warehouse knew more than they were saying. The question was whether they were protecting Elena's business, protecting themselves, or protecting someone else entirely. Back at the brownstone, the familiar aroma of Fritz's cooking, something involving duck and herbs, was a welcome antidote to the warehouse's corrupted atmosphere. I found Wolfe in the office, settled behind his desk with a book, having completed his afternoon orchid session and his lunch. I placed the samples and evidence on his desk, along with my detailed notes. The warehouse is secure but not impregnable, and we had an interesting visitor who brought his own evidence. Wolfe closed his book and regarded the sealed containers with the expression he usually reserved for inferior beer. Mr. Chen, I presume. And what did this former partner contribute to our understanding? I laid out the photograph, the contaminated garlic sample, and the story of the midnight meeting. He claims someone is trying to frame him for the sabotage. He also says other importers are being targeted with similar methods. Mercaptans and amines, Wolfe said, picking up one of the sealed jars. Theatrical chemistry designed to assault the senses. The perpetrator wants not merely to damage, but to humiliate. This suggests personal animosity rather than simple business competition. Carmen Rodriguez has been working unusual hours and has access to everything that matters. I continued, but she claims she's being framed, and there's evidence that someone impersonated her to contact Marcus. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the contaminated samples. Archie, tomorrow you will return to the warehouse. I want you to examine their cleaning supplies, pest control records, and any recent changes in operational procedures. Sometimes, the most obvious solutions hide in plain sight. He picked up the photograph of Marcus entering the warehouse. Also, determine who else knew about Mr. Chen's midnight appointment. Someone wanted him documented at that location, which suggests either remarkable foresight or inside knowledge of his movements. You think Carmen is innocent? I asked. I think, Wolfe said, settling back in his chair, that someone has taken considerable trouble to create a web of suspicion and misdirection. The question is whether they are protecting themselves or destroying someone else. Possibly both. As I prepared for dinner, I reflected that this case had all the elements Wolfe found most engaging. Systematic sabotage, personal betrayal, and the corruption of something pure. The garlic might smell of death, but the lies were beginning to smell even worse. And in my experience, when lies start to stink, the truth usually isn't far behind. The morning brought the kind of October crispness that makes you believe autumn might actually be worth the approaching winter, but my optimism lasted exactly as long as it took to smell the warehouse again. I'd returned to Elena Vasquez's facility, armed with Wolfe's instructions to examine the prosaic details: cleaning supplies, pest control records, operational changes. It wasn't the kind of assignment that quickens the pulse, but Wolfe had a talent for finding significance in the mundane, and I'd learned not to question his methods. David Park met me at the entrance with a clipboard and the expression of a man who'd been losing sleep over garlic. "The cleaning supplies are in the utility closet," he said without preamble. "Standard industrial stuff, nothing exotic enough to explain our problems." The utility closet was exactly as advertised. Buckets, mops, industrial-sized containers of detergent and disinfectant that looked as innocent as such things ever do. I made notes anyway because Wolfe had specifically requested it, but nothing suggested a clandestine chemistry laboratory hidden behind the floor wax. "What about pest control?" I asked, closing the closet door. David led me to a metal filing cabinet and pulled out a folder marked Compliance. "We switched services about 6 weeks ago. Carmen recommended a new company, said they specialized in food storage facilities and offered better rates." I flipped through the service reports until a logo caught my attention. Hygieia Preventive Services, rendered in tasteful blue letters. Their first visit was documented 5 weeks earlier. Before that, a different company had held the contract for 3 years without incident. "What exactly did Hygieia do differently?" I asked, studying the neat, almost too perfect reports. "They installed some kind of odor control system," David said, frowning at the memory. "Little sachets placed strategically around the storage areas. The technician said they'd absorb volatile compounds that might affect product quality." My interest sharpened considerably. "Do you still have any of these sachets?" "A few. I kept them when I found them loose in some of the crates. Figured I should document everything once the problem started." He rummaged through a storage box and produced 2 small white sachets sealed in clear plastic. Through the fabric, I could see beige granules that definitely didn't smell like peppermint. I bagged both sachets carefully, noting that they bore the same Hygieia logo. "Who authorized this odor control program?" Carmen handled all the vendor coordination. She said Elena had approved the upgrade. David's expression suggested he was beginning to have doubts about that approval process. Before I could pursue that line of inquiry further, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized. Saul Panzer, Wolfe's most reliable operative. "Archie?" Saul's voice was characteristically direct. "Wolfe asked me to look into those other contamination cases Marcus Chen mentioned. I've got some interesting connections." "I'm listening," I said, pulling out my notebook. 3 businesses, 3 weeks, same pattern. Giuseppe Martinelli's olive oil, Rebecca Walsh's cheese, now Elena Vasquez's garlic. All 3 recently switched to the same pest control service, Hygieia Preventive Services. All 3 had odor control systems installed in their storage areas. The pieces were clicking into place with satisfying precision. What do we know about Hygieia? That's where it gets interesting. The company was incorporated 6 months ago. Single owner, minimal assets, operates out of a mail drop in Queens. But here's the kicker. Their insurance is bonded through the same agency that handles Carmen Rodriguez's mother's medical bills. That stopped me cold. Carmen's connected to Hygieia? Not directly. But someone made sure she'd have access to information about the company's operations. And Archie, Carmen Rodriguez has been taking night courses in mortuary science for the past 8 months. After I hung up, David Park was staring at me with the expression of someone who just realized the termites were in the foundation. Carmen studying mortuary science? She never mentioned that. People don't usually advertise their career changes. I said. But it would explain how someone acquired the chemical knowledge to create compounds that smell like death. I called Elena from David's office. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight with stress. Elena, I need to ask you about Carmen's night school courses, I said without preamble. Silence hummed on the line for several seconds. How did... You... Yes, she's been studying mortuary science. Her mother's illness made her want to help other families during difficult times. I thought it was admirable. Did you know she recommended Hygeia Preventive Services? She brought me a proposal. Said our previous pest control company was missing problems and this new service offered better protection at lower cost. I approved the change. Elena's voice grew smaller. Are you saying Carmen is responsible for this? I'm saying someone with access to mortuary chemicals and knowledge of your operations has been very busy, I replied. But the pattern extends beyond your business. 2 other importers have had identical problems with identical methods. When I returned to the brownstone, Fritz met me at the door with the expression of a man whose kitchen had been violated by offensive odors. Archie, please tell me you have not brought more of those abominations into Monsieur Wolfe's house. Just samples, I assured him, holding up the evidence bags containing the Hygeia sachets, and I'll keep them on the radiator cover with the windows open. I found Wolfe in the office, settled behind his desk with a book on organic chemistry. He looked up as I entered, his dark eyes taking in the evidence bags with the expression he usually reserved for inferior beer. The cleaning supplies were unremarkable, I reported, settling into my chair, but the pest control angle paid off. Hygeia Preventive Services has been installing odor control sachets in the storage areas of all 3 contaminated businesses. Carmen Rodriguez recommended the service and has been studying mortuary science, which would give her access to the chemicals needed to create these compounds. Wolfe examined one of the sachets through its plastic container, holding it up to the light from the window. Ingenious. The delivery system appears legitimate while providing perfect cover for systematic contamination. But consider the scope, Archie. 3 businesses, coordinated timing, professional execution. This suggests either remarkable individual planning or organizational support. Saul found a connection between Hygeia's insurance bonding and Carmen's mother's medical expenses. I continued. Someone wanted Carmen to have access to information about the company's operations. Indeed, someone has orchestrated this campaign with considerable sophistication. Wolfe set down the sachet and fixed me with his penetrating gaze. The question is whether Ms. Rodriguez is the architect of this scheme or merely its instrument. You think she's being manipulated? I think someone has identified her vulnerabilities: financial desperation, chemical knowledge, operational access, and exploited them systematically. The real question is who benefits from the destruction of these 3 businesses. Wolfe was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the contaminated evidence. Archie, tomorrow you will visit the offices of Hygeia Preventive Services. I suspect you will find them as substantial as morning mist. You will also determine who else knew of Ms. Rodriguez's financial difficulties and educational pursuits. And Carmen herself. Ms. Rodriguez will surface when she realizes that running away confirms guilt rather than avoiding it. In the meantime, we have evidence of method and opportunity. What we need now is motive. Wolfe picked up his book. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to destroy trust in specialty food imports. That suggests either remarkable malice or remarkable ambition. As I prepared the evidence for proper storage, I reflected that this case was developing the kind of systematic complexity that engaged Wolfe's finest instincts. We had moved beyond simple business sabotage into something that resembled a coordinated campaign. The garlic might smell of death, but the lies were beginning to smell even worse. And in my experience, when lies start to stink badly enough, The truth usually isn't far behind. The morning brought the kind of October, crispness that makes you believe autumn might actually be worth the approaching winter, but my optimism lasted exactly as long as it took to discover that Hygeia Preventive Services was about as substantial as morning mist. The address Saul had provided led me to a gleaming glass tower in Midtown that specialized in virtual offices and mail forwarding services. The receptionist, polite but firm, informed me that Hygeia operated remotely, and all inquiries were to be directed to an email address that looked suspiciously temporary. I shifted tactics and headed to Queens, where a different address on their invoices led me to a narrow storefront wedged between a check-cashing operation and a cell phone repair shop. The building's elevator wheezed like an asthmatic climbing stairs, and Suite 4B bore only a small placard with the Hygeia logo. Inside, I found a thin man in his 50s wearing a maintenance uniform and the expression of someone caught doing something he shouldn't. "We're closed," he said, making no effort to sound convincing. "Mr. Kellerman?" I asked, consulting the incorporation papers. "I'm Archie Goodwin. I represent several clients who've used your odor control services." "I just clean the office," he replied quickly. "The lady who rents the space comes in maybe twice a week, leaves instructions, pays me in cash. Small, dark hair, always dressed nice. Spoke good English but had an accent, maybe Spanish." The description matched Carmen Rodriguez perfectly. I examined the papers scattered on his desk. Service reports, client contracts, supply invoices, all professionally prepared, all bearing signatures of customers who'd been systematically sabotaged. The handwriting was neat, feminine, and familiar from Elena's warehouse inventory sheets. My next stop was Piscataway and Athanor Labs, a beige industrial facility that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd given up on aesthetics. The sales representative, a sharp-eyed woman named Dina, didn't light up when I mentioned Hygeia, but she definitely reacted to odor control sachets. "We sell neutralizers and absorbents," she explained, pulling up records on her computer. Hygeia ordered a custom matrix, activated carbon with polymer binder and proprietary additives. The purchase orders were very precise. Name on the account: Hygeia Preventive Services. Contact C. Rodriguez. She checked her screen again. Payment was prepaid cards and bank checks from a Queens credit union. Shipments went to a commercial receiving address, then courier pickup. I made one more stop before returning to Manhattan, the community college where Carmen was studying mortuary science. A conversation with the admissions office confirmed her enrollment and exemplary performance, particularly in courses like advanced embalming chemistry and odor management for post-mortem care. One of her classmates, a morbidly cheerful young man named Kevin, remembered Carmen as intensely focused. She was always asking about the most effective ways to neutralize putrefactive odors, he told me. Said she had a personal interest in the subject. Recently, she'd been spending time with a new friend from class. Quiet fellow who never spoke much but always waited for her after class in a dark sedan. I returned to the brownstone in the late afternoon, my head buzzing with connections and implications. The pieces were forming a picture far more complex than simple business sabotage. It looked like a meticulously orchestrated campaign with Carmen Rodriguez, either as willing participant or desperate pawn. I headed straight for the office, where Wolfe was settled in his chair with a tome on ancient Greek philosophy. The sealed evidence bags containing the Hygeia sachets and contaminated garlic samples were still on the radiator cover, exactly where I'd left them that morning. Or so I thought. My eyes, trained by years of observation, caught something subtle. The small plastic bag containing the clean Provence garlic sample, meant for comparison, seemed different. The seal wasn't quite as tight as I remembered, and as I leaned closer, a faint aroma wafted up. Not the rich, earthy scent of good garlic, but a ghost of that putrid, deathly odor. Someone had been in the office. Someone had tampered with the evidence. Wolfe looked up, his eyes narrowing as he caught the sudden tension in my posture. "Something amiss, Archie." "You could say that." I carefully picked up the compromised sample. "I think someone paid us a visit while I was out." This was a clean sample this morning. Now it's got a faint whiff of the same corruption, and the seal looks tampered with. Wolfe slowly closed his book, and the air in the room seemed to thicken with silent, formidable anger. The sanctity of his brownstone had been violated. This wasn't merely a crime. It was a personal affront. "Indeed," he rumbled, his voice low. "A subtle trespass, a deliberate escalation. Who would have the audacity, the knowledge, and the access to commit such an act in this house?" "That's the million-dollar question," I replied. No forced entry, no signs of disturbance. Whoever it was knew our schedules and knew exactly what they were looking for. Or what they wished to plant, Wolfe corrected. "This suggests not merely tampering, but psychological warfare. To introduce doubt, to suggest that even here, contamination is inescapable." I laid out my findings from the day. The shell company operation, Carmen's mortuary science studies, her mysterious classmate with the dark sedan, and the systematic nature of the chemical procurement. Wolfe listened without interruption, his fingers drumming once on his desk blotter. Before I could finish my report, the phone rang. Marcus Chen's voice was tight with controlled urgency. "Mr. Goodwin, I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately. Someone broke into my warehouse last night and planted contaminated sachets in my storage areas. I'm about to lose everything Elena lost, and I think I know who's behind it." Wolfe had been listening to my side of the conversation. "Tell Mr. Chen to come immediately," he said. "And Archie, call Saul. I want him to locate Ms. Rodriguez before someone else does. Her situation suggests she may be in more danger than she realizes." As I made the calls, Elena's voice came through on the other line. "Mr. Goodwin, Carmen never came home last night. Her landlord called. Her apartment door was standing open and some of her things are missing. I found a note in her desk drawer. She read it to me. Elena, I never wanted to hurt you, but some choices aren't really choices. The money was supposed to help Mama, but it only made everything worse. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Don't try to find me. Some debts can't be paid with money, and some people don't forgive. Tell Mr. Wolfe that the real enemy isn't who he thinks it is. Carmen." After I hung up, Wolfe sat quietly for a moment, his gaze fixed on the contaminated evidence. "Ms. Rodriguez has been coerced," he said finally. "Someone has identified her vulnerabilities, financial desperation, chemical knowledge, operational access, and exploited them systematically. But consider the scope, Archie. 3 businesses, coordinated timing, professional execution. This suggests organizational support. The mysterious classmate with the dark sedan. Among others, someone has orchestrated this campaign with considerable sophistication, and now they have challenged us directly by violating this house." Wolfe's voice carried the weight of a judge pronouncing sentence. "The question is whether they seek to intimidate us or simply demonstrate their reach." Reflected that our case had developed exactly the kind of systematic complexity that made Wolfe's eyes gleam with anticipation. We'd moved beyond simple sabotage into coordinated market manipulation. The garlic might smell of death, but the conspiracy was beginning to smell like something much more ambitious. And when ambitious conspiracies made the mistake of challenging Nero Wolfe personally, they usually ended up regretting it. The quiet humph. The brownstone now felt like a taut wire. The game had changed. The subtle trespass wasn't just evidence, it was a gauntlet thrown down, a personal challenge to the formidable intellect within these walls. Someone had made this personal, and that was their first serious mistake. As Fritz announced dinner, Wolfe rose from his chair with the deliberate grace of a man preparing for war. "Tomorrow, Archie, we will discover who believes they can corrupt the very air we breathe, and we will teach them the error of their presumption." The morning after the subtle trespass brought the kind of October clarity that makes you believe you can see trouble coming from 3 blocks away. But the white panel van idling across the street had been there for 25 minutes with the patience of a professional. No markings, New Jersey plates, driver slouched low behind tinted windows. I'd seen more subtle surveillance from amateur divorce investigators. I gave it another 10 minutes to prove me wrong, then called Saul. He listened, grunted once and said, "Don't approach. Send me the plate number. I'll circle the block and take a look." When I hung up, Wolfe was already in the office, settled behind his desk with a monograph on volatile sulfur compounds. He spoke without looking up. A van, New Jersey plates, professional patience, and the kind of interest in our facade that suggests they're not here for the architecture. I pulled out my notebook. Either we've acquired admirers, or someone wants us to know we're being watched. If they wished to remain unobserved, they would have succeeded. Wolfe replied, closing the book with the soft finality that meant his attention was engaged. Therefore, they wish us to know of their presence. A psychological tactic designed to suggest omnipresence. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang with the urgent insistence that usually means trouble wearing expensive shoes. Through the one-way glass, I could see Marcus Chen on the stoop, his usual composure replaced by the controlled desperation of a man watching his life's work crumble in real time. I let him in, and he followed me to the office carrying a briefcase and the kind of barely contained panic that comes from being systematically destroyed by an invisible enemy. Fritz had already prepared coffee, which Marcus accepted with the gratitude of a man who hadn't slept. "Mr. Wolfe," Marcus began without preamble, "they hit my warehouse last night. Same method, same results. My premium Italian olive oil, my aged balsamic vinegar, all of it contaminated with that death smell. I had to quarantine half my inventory." He opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder. "But I've been conducting my own investigation. The pattern extends far beyond Elena's business. Someone is systematically targeting specialty food importers throughout the tri-state area, but not randomly. They're selecting businesses that compete directly with one specific operation." Wolfe leaned forward slightly, which for him was equivalent to standing at attention. "You have identified the beneficiary." Marcus spread several documents across the desk. Incorporation papers, business licenses, supplier contracts. Meridian Specialty Foods. They've been acquiring contracts from every business that's been sabotaged. The Meridian restaurant that canceled Elena's contract. It's owned by the same corporate structure that owns the distribution company. I studied the documents while Marcus continued. The company was incorporated 8 months ago through a law firm that specializes in anonymous corporate structures. The actual ownership is buried behind shell companies, but I found one connection: the insurance bonding agency that handles Carmen Rodriguez's mother's medical expenses also underwrites Meridian's liability insurance. My phone buzzed with a text from Saul. "Van belongs to Marion Logistics. Client, Tillinghast Ridge Partners. Also found CR Safe House in Astoria, not alone. Surveillance suggests coercion, not cooperation." I showed the message to Wolfe, whose expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over Queens. "Ms. Rodriguez is being held." "Looks that way. Saul says she's with someone matching the description of her mysterious classmate, the one with the dark sedan. And there's more." I consulted my notes. Tillinghast Ridge Partners is a private equity fund that's been making approaches to specialty importers whose reputations have suddenly become delicate. Marcus nodded grimly. They approached Elena and me 6 months ago. Consolidation play. We declined. They also courted Rebecca Walsh and Giuseppe Martinelli, the other contaminated businesses. None of us were interested in selling. Until now, Wolfe observed, when selling might seem preferable to bankruptcy. Before Marcus could respond, my phone rang. Elena Vasquez's voice was tight with controlled panic. "Mr. Goodwin, something's happening at the warehouse." Someone called David Park, told him Carmen had been found dead and that the police wanted to question me immediately. But when I called the precinct, they had no record of any call. "Where are you now?" I asked, signaling to Wolfe that we had multiple crises developing. "Driving to the warehouse." David sounded terrified, said there were men in suits asking questions about our pest control services. "Elena, turn around immediately and go to the nearest police station. Don't go to the warehouse under any circumstances." But the line had already gone dead. Wolfe's fingers drummed once on his desk blotter, his equivalent of pounding the table. They are forcing multiple confrontations simultaneously. Ms. Vasquez is being drawn into danger, while Ms. Rodriguez is held as leverage. This suggests either remarkable coordination or remarkable desperation. The phone rang again. Fritz's voice was carefully controlled, but carried an undertone of outrage that made my blood pressure spike. "Archie, a delivery was attempted. Flowers for Mr. Wolfe. I received them at the door, but they were not flowers. Camouflaged sachets hidden in the stems. I smelled the corruption through the paper and disposed of them with bleach. But that they would attempt such violation here. Unspeakable." I agreed, and my tone matched his fury. "Tell Mr. Wolfe we'll be right there." When I relayed Fritz's report, Wolfe's composure didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, the kind of cold calculation that usually preceded someone's comprehensive destruction. They have escalated from business sabotage to personal assault. The contaminated flowers were designed to introduce doubt about the security of this house, to suggest that even here, corruption is inescapable. Marcus gathered his documents with shaking hands. "What do we do now? They have Carmen, they're threatening Elena, and they're targeting you directly. Now we demonstrate why challenging Nero Wolfe personally is invariably a strategic error," Wolfe replied, rising from his chair with deliberate grace. "Archie, call Inspector Kramer and inform him we may require police support within the hour. Then contact Saul and tell him to maintain surveillance on Ms. Rodriguez, but take no action until we arrive." "You're going to Astoria?" I asked, surprised. "We are going to Astoria. The violation of this house demands a personal response." Wolfe moved toward the door with the measured pace of a man who had decided that patience was no longer a virtue. "Mr. Chen, you will contact every restaurant that canceled contracts with Elena and yourself. Inform them that you have identified the source of contamination and can guarantee clean inventory within 24 hours. Make it clear that Meridian Specialty Foods has been deliberately sabotaging their suppliers. You want to force them into desperate action. I want them to reveal themselves through panic. When their carefully orchestrated scheme begins to unravel, they will make mistakes. And when they make mistakes..." Wolfe paused at the office doorway, his bulk filling the frame like a judicial pronouncement. "They will discover that some violations cannot be forgiven. As we prepared to leave the brownstone, I reflected that our case had evolved from simple business sabotage into something far more dangerous. A coordinated campaign of market manipulation backed by serious money and professional expertise. But the perpetrators had made one crucial error. They had made it personal. The garlic might smell of death, but justice was beginning to smell like victory. And in my experience, When Nero Wolfe decided to take justice personally, the results were usually both swift and comprehensive. The van across the street had disappeared, but that didn't matter anymore. We knew who they were, we knew what they wanted, and we were about to teach them why violating the sanctity of the brownstone was the kind of mistake that people remember for the rest of their considerably shortened careers. We were 3 steps from the front door when Wolfe stopped, as if the parquet had turned to quicksand. He tilted his massive head back, closed his eyes, and expelled the kind of disgusted sound that would have made a less confident man apologize to the air itself. Phooey, I was indulging a rhetorical flourish. I am not going to Astoria. I pivoted to face him, notebook still in hand. I'll try to contain my disappointment. You will not try. You will go. With Mr. Panzer. With police support. He moved back toward his desk with the deliberate grace of a man who had just remembered the fundamental laws of his universe. I will remain here and conduct this investigation as it ought to be conducted, by arrangement and orchestration, not by excursion into the wilds of Queens. He settled into his chair and pressed the phone button with the authority of a man who had dismissed emperors in previous incarnations. Inspector Kramer, if you please. Kramer came on the line with his usual blend of gravel and barely controlled impatience. Wolfe gave him 30 seconds of precise information. The contaminated flowers, the surveillance van, the safe house address, and the systematic campaign to force distressed sales of specialty food businesses. He didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, didn't waste words. He didn't need to. By the time Wolfe finished, Kramer's breathing had acquired the extra gear that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. All right, Wolfe. You'll give me Panzer's location, and I'll put cars on it. If this turns out to be another one of your wild goose chases. It will not, Inspector. Send officers who can recognize a trap without insisting on stepping into it. Wolfe clicked off and turned his attention to me. The Astoria address, Archie. Coordinate with Mr. Panzer for the retrieval of Miss Rodriguez. Then call Mr. Cohen at the Gazette and inform him that at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening, Nero Wolfe will publicly demonstrate the contamination method and name the financial interests behind this conspiracy. Attribution to an unnamed source. Naturally. What about the people behind Meridian? I asked, pulling out my phone. Also invite Ms. Vasquez, Mr. Chen, Mr. Park, and a representative of Meridian Specialty Foods to attend here tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Their counsel of record, specifically. And if they decline, note the refusal carefully. It will prove useful. Wolfe picked up his current book, a monograph on the chemistry of volatile compounds. Fear breeds attendance, Archie, and tomorrow we will provide them with ample reason for both. I called Saul first. He was already positioned a block from the safe house, maintaining surveillance with a professional invisibility that made him invaluable. The address was a narrow brick 2-family house on a quiet Astoria side street, distinguished only by new locks and a black sedan with the alert posture of a guard dog. How many inside? I asked. Carmen Rodriguez and the quiet man from her mortuary science class. Plus 2 others who arrived this morning. Expensive suits, careful movements, the kind of professional courtesy that suggests serious organizational backing. Saul's voice carried the calm precision of a man who'd been watching dangerous people for decades. This isn't amateur hour, Archie. Next, I called Lon Cohen at the Gazette. When I mentioned that Wolfe would be making a public demonstration involving contaminated food and financial conspiracy, I could practically hear his pencils sharpening through the phone line. If Wolfe announced the second coming, I'd want 2 sources, Lon said, but I'd run it anyway. What time did you say? 6 o'clock. That gives me time for a full spread in the evening edition. The cavalry arrived in Queens with the efficiency that Kramer brought to operations. He took personally. A precinct sergeant who'd seen too many doors and preferred them open. 2 plainclothes detectives, 2 uniforms. No sirens, no drama, just the quiet competence of professionals who understood that some situations required finesse. Saul coordinated the approach from his observation post. Front door, back door, and fire escape covered. The quiet man, goes by Vale apparently, has been making phone calls every hour, getting nervous about something. The door opened after the second authoritative knock. Vale appeared in the doorway, pale, narrow-featured, with eyes like wet cement and the kind of build that encouraged people to underestimate it. The sergeant's badge did its work with bureaucratic efficiency. No dramatics, no heroics. Vale took one look at the uniforms and decided his best option was dignified surrender. The living room smelled faintly of synthetic citrus, trying too hard to mask something unpleasant. On a card table by the window sat the tools of systematic sabotage. Half-assembled cloth sachets, bags of granular media, and a precision scale that belonged in a laboratory. Vale was escorted to a chair and parked there with the kind of professional attention that discouraged sudden movements. Carmen Rodriguez was in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with her, hands folded in her lap as if she'd been waiting for a school principal. Her face had the washed-out look of someone who'd been running in circles for days without finding an exit. When she saw me, something in her shoulders finally gave out. "Did Elena believe the note?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She believed what she had to," I said, keeping my tone gentle, "but Mr. Wolfe knows better. You can tell him what you want him to believe." Back at the brownstone, Wolfe didn't rise when we entered the office. He didn't need to. Carmen took the red leather chair and stared at the sealed evidence sachets on the radiator cover, the way a penitent looks at relics. Wolfe observed her for a full minute with the patience of stone watching a stream find its course. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "you are not the prime mover in this conspiracy. You are the instrument. You will tell us who supplied the contamination media, who selected the targets, who provided the financing, and who applied the coercion." Her first words came out in pieces, like a confession that had been rehearsed but never spoken. He called himself Vale. I don't know if that's his real name. He approached me after mortuary science class, said he'd been watching my work, admired my dedication to my mother's care. She looked up at Wolfe with the expression of someone who'd been carrying a terrible weight. He knew everything: my mother's medical bills, my work schedule at the warehouse, Elena's supplier relationships. He said there was a way to make money without hurting anyone. The sachets were neutralizers, he claimed, designed to protect products during storage and transport. "When did you realize the true nature of the operation?" Wolfe asked. "When the first restaurant canceled Elena's contract. The chef called the garlic an abomination, said it smelled like death itself. I confronted Vale, told him I wanted out." Carmen's voice grew smaller. "That's when he showed me the bank records. Payments to my mother's medical account that could be traced back to me. He said I was already implicated. That cooperation was my only protection." "Vale works directly for Meridian Specialty Foods," I interjected. Carmen shook her head. "He said he represented the financial interests behind Meridian, a private equity fund called Tillinghast Ridge Partners. I never met anyone else from the organization, but sometimes a woman would call with specific instructions, delivery schedules, target locations. She had an educated voice, very precise. "Describe Vale's methods," Wolfe commanded. "Methodical. Patient. He never raised his voice, never showed emotion. He always seemed to know what I would say before I said it." Her eyes flicked to the evidence sachets. "He carried one of those with him always, as a reminder of what would happen if I refused to cooperate." Wolfe's mouth flattened into a line that suggested someone was about to regret their life choices. Mr. Goodwin, inquire whether our guest from Astoria responds to the name Vale. I called Saul, who was still coordinating with the police. His answer was characteristically succinct. He's carrying identification for 3 different names, and none of them is Vale. But he definitely smiled when I mentioned it. Wolfe nodded with satisfaction. Inspector Kramer will extract the remaining details through official channels. Miss Rodriguez, you will remain here for the immediate future. Your apartment has been compromised, and your safety remains in question until this conspiracy is fully exposed. He turned to me with the expression of a general deploying his final reserves. Archie, deliver written invitations for tomorrow's gathering to Miss Vasquez, Mr. Chen, Mr. Park, and Meridian's legal counsel. Inform Inspector Kramer that we will require his presence at 8 o'clock. Confirm the arrangements with Mr. Cohen. You're baiting a school of piranha, I observed. What exactly are you dangling? Wolfe looked at the contaminated sachets with the expression he usually reserved for inferior wine. Certainty, Archie, and the promise of an antidote to their systematic corruption. The remainder of the afternoon was devoted to clerical work with sharp edges. Elena arrived long enough to see Carmen shed tears without collapsing and accept Wolfe's terms for tomorrow's confrontation. Marcus Chen received his invitation with the controlled fury of a man who discovered that the game he'd been playing had a second board underneath it. David Park accepted his summons with the measured sincerity of someone who'd never used a word he couldn't defend in court. Meridian's counsel, one Aldous Thorne with a voice like expensive seltzer water, attempted to substitute a business representative for tomorrow's gathering. Wolfe declined with polite absolutism. Counsel or principal, Mr. Thorne. No one else will be admitted. By 6 o'clock, Lon Cohen had the evening edition hitting the streets with a teaser that would make interesting reading in certain corporate boardrooms. By 6:30, the surveillance van was back across the street, and it had acquired companions. They didn't attempt anything dramatic, which told me they were doing exactly what they were being paid to do. Watch and report. Just before Fritz announced dinner, Kramer called with an update that carried the satisfaction of a man whose patience had finally been rewarded. Wolfe, our quiet friend, coughed up a second address, a storage facility in Long Island City. We found assembly kits, courier receipts, and a ledger that takes the scenic route, but eventually spells Meridian in the right handwriting. Also found enough contamination materials to poison half the specialty food market in the tri-state area. Excellent, Inspector. And the financial connections. Still working on those. The shell companies are layered like an onion, but we're peeling them back. Should have something solid by tomorrow morning. After Fritz's Blanquette de Veau had restored my faith in several fundamental institutions, I made a final security check of the brownstone. Carmen was asleep in the guest room, her dinner tray barely touched on the bedside table. The house had resumed its normal evening murmur, but it was the kind of quiet that comes just before a conductor raises his baton and 80 musicians decide whether to trust his interpretation. I found Wolfe in the office, reading his chemistry monograph by the light of the desk lamp. The surveillance van has multiplied, I reported. 3 vehicles now, all with New Jersey plates. He grunted without looking up. Fear breeds attendance. The garlic might smell of death, I said, switching off the overhead lights, but nothing perfumes a room quite like panic. Wolfe allowed himself a small curve of satisfaction. Tomorrow, Archie, panic will suffice for our immediate purposes. The day after, we shall require contrition. As I headed upstairs, I reflected that our case had evolved into exactly the kind of systematic intellectual challenge that engaged Wolfe's finest instincts. We'd moved beyond simple business sabotage into coordinated market manipulation, backed by serious money and professional expertise. But the perpetrators had made one crucial error. They had made it personal by violating the sanctity of the brownstone. The garlic might have smelled of death, but justice was beginning to smell like inevitable victory. And in my experience, when Nero Wolfe decided that justice required his personal attention, the results were usually both swift and comprehensive. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, the moment when all the careful orchestration would culminate in the kind of revelation that made Wolfe's reputation. The pieces were in position, the players were summoned, and the truth was ready to be served with the precision of one of Fritz's perfect meals. Some violations, as Wolfe had observed, could not be forgiven. Tomorrow, we would demonstrate exactly what that meant. By 5 o'clock, the office had acquired the formal tension that precedes either a wedding or a hanging. And from the expressions on our assembled guests, most of them were betting on the latter. Wolfe had adjusted his chair precisely 2 degrees and declared the geometry satisfactory. I had arranged the red leather chairs in a semicircle facing his desk, with additional seating borrowed from the front room to accommodate what was shaping up to be the largest gathering in the brownstone's recent history. The surveillance vans had multiplied overnight. 4 now, representing what appeared to be a small convention of professional watchers. Through the one-way glass, I could see men in expensive suits trying to look inconspicuous while radiating the kind of alert tension that suggested someone was paying them very well to be nervous. Helena arrived first, accompanied by David Park, both carrying themselves with the careful dignity of people who'd learned to expect bad news, but were hoping for justice. Marcus Chen followed 5 minutes later, his usual urbane composure replaced by the controlled fury of a man who discovered that business competition had acquired some very ugly new rules. At 5:15, the doorbell announced our most important guest. Through the glass, I could see a woman in her early 50s, impeccably dressed in the understated way that costs serious money, carrying a briefcase that probably contained either salvation or damnation for everyone in the room. "Ms. Victoria Ashford," she announced when I opened the door, extending a business card with the efficiency of a diplomat presenting credentials. "Tillinghast Ridge Partners. I believe Mr. Wolfe is expecting me." I wasn't, but her arrival explained the multiplication of surveillance vehicles. "Right this way, Ms. Ashford. You're just in time for the main event." Wolfe looked up from his book as we entered, his dark eyes taking in our new arrival with the expression he usually reserved for particularly interesting specimens. "Ms. Ashford, you represent the financial interests behind this systematic campaign of market manipulation?" "I represent legitimate investment opportunities in the specialty food sector," she replied, settling into the red leather chair with the composure of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "If there have been misunderstandings about our business practices, I'm here to discuss resolution." Before Wolfe could respond, the doorbell rang again. This time it was Aldous Thorne, Meridian's legal counsel, arriving with 2 junior associates in the kind of barely controlled panic that suggested his afternoon had not proceeded according to plan. "Mr. Wolfe," Thorne said, following me into the increasingly crowded office. I wasn't aware that Tillinghast Ridge would be represented separately. Nor was I. Wolfe replied, his gaze moving between Ashford and Thorne with the interest of a chess master watching 2 opponents discover they'd been playing different games. "Ms. Ashford, perhaps you could clarify the relationship between your organization and Mr. Thorne's client." Tillinghast Ridge is a private equity fund with diversified interests in specialty food distribution, she replied, her voice maintaining its professional neutrality despite Thorne's obvious discomfort. "Meridian Specialty Foods is one of several companies we've been evaluating for potential acquisition." "Evaluating?" Thorne's voice carried the pitch of a man who just realized he'd been swimming with sharks. "Ms. Ashford, my client was under the impression that Tillinghast Ridge was a financing partner, not a potential acquirer." At precisely 5:30, Inspector Kramer arrived with the punctuality that made him invaluable and the expression that made him dangerous. He took the chair I'd positioned near the door, close enough to participate, far enough to observe. Behind him came Lon Cohen from the Gazette, notebook ready, eyes bright with the anticipation of a story that would sell papers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, rising from his chair with the deliberate grace of a judge taking the bench. "You have been assembled to witness the resolution of a conspiracy that has corrupted the very essence of commerce itself." He moved to the radiator cover and selected one of the sealed evidence sachets. This device was designed to introduce compounds that would make premium food products smell of death itself. The chemistry is sophisticated. Mercaptans and organic amines activated by humidity and temperature. The delivery method is ingenious, camouflaged as legitimate pest control services. The psychological impact is devastating, the complete destruction of trust in a product's quality. The perpetrators identified businesses whose destruction would benefit their portfolio companies, then systematically contaminated their inventory using an operative with access to mortuary science chemicals and intimate knowledge of warehouse operations. Klaus Ashford's professional composure developed the first hairline cracks. "Mr. Wolfe, you're describing a hypothetical scenario and attributing it to unnamed parties. I am describing the contents of a storage facility in Long Island City raided yesterday by Inspector Kramer's officers." Wolfe replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Assembly materials, courier receipts, and a detailed ledger documenting targets, methods, and projected acquisitions. The operative responsible, Vincent Aldrich, known to his victims as Vale, is currently in police custody and proving remarkably cooperative. Elena was staring at the evidence sachets with the expression of someone watching the instrument of her near destruction. "You did this to us. You poisoned our reputations, destroyed our relationships with clients, all so you could buy our businesses at fire sale prices." "Ms. Vasquez," Ashford replied, her voice still controlled but carrying new undertones of strain. "If a rogue contractor engaged in misconduct, that's a matter for law enforcement, not wild accusations." "There was no rogue contractor," Wolfe said, pressing a button on his desk. "Miss Rodriguez, please join us." Carmen entered with the measured step of someone walking to judgment. She took the remaining chair and looked directly at Victoria Ashford. That's her. She called herself Victoria, never gave a last name, always very precise about timing, locations, which products to target first. "I've never seen this woman before in my life," Ashford said, but her voice had lost its professional polish. "Ms. Rodriguez," Wolfe continued, "please describe the voice of the woman who provided your instructions." "Educated. Precise. She always knew exactly which restaurants would be affected when they would discover the contamination, how they would react. She knew things that only someone with access to the restaurant's purchasing schedules could know." Thorne was staring at Ashford with the expression of a man who just realized his client had been used as camouflage for a larger operation. "Ms. Ashford, if Tillinghast Ridge has been conducting unauthorized operations using Meridian's business relationships as cover—" "Mr. Thorne," Wolfe interrupted, "your client was never the architect of this conspiracy. They were its unwitting beneficiary and ultimate victim. Ms. Ashford's organization identified Meridian as the perfect front, legitimate operations, established relationships, and sufficient naivety to provide cover for systematic market manipulation." Ashford stood with the controlled precision of someone who decided that dignified retreat was preferable to comprehensive defeat. "Mr. Wolfe, you have no proof of any connection between Tillinghast Ridge and these alleged activities." "On the contrary." Wolfe pressed another button on his desk. "Inspector Kramer has been quite thorough in his investigation." Kramer rose from his chair with the measured authority of a man carrying handcuffs and the legal power to use them. Ms. Victoria Ashford, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit industrial sabotage, extortion, coercion, and about 6 other felonies that the district attorney is still cataloging. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Ashford's professional composure finally shattered completely. This is preposterous. I'm a legitimate businesswoman with connections throughout the financial community. You can't prove. We can prove that Vincent Aldrich has provided detailed testimony about your organization's methods, Kramer replied. Bank records, phone logs, surveillance footage, and a comprehensive confession that places you at the center of this entire operation. After the police had departed with their prize, the office felt larger, as if a malignant presence had been surgically removed. Wolfe returned to his chair with the satisfaction of a surgeon who'd successfully excised a particularly virulent tumor. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "I suggest you advise your client to cooperate fully with the investigation. Meridian's unwitting participation may mitigate criminal charges, but their continued existence depends on immediate and complete transparency with both law enforcement and their defrauded supplier." Elena looked at Carmen with the expression of someone trying to rebuild trust from the foundation up. "Can you come back to work? If you'll have me, and if I can figure out how to live with what I've done." "We'll figure it out together," Elena replied. "That's what families do." As our guests prepared to leave, Marcus Chen approached Wolfe's desk with the expression of a man who'd learned something important about the nature of modern commerce. "Mr. Wolfe, how did you know that Ashford was the real power behind the conspiracy?" "The contamination was too sophisticated for amateur sabotage, too systematic for individual malice," Wolfe replied. "It required institutional backing, professional execution, and intimate knowledge of market dynamics. Miss Ashford's organization possessed all 3, plus the financial resources to sustain a campaign of this scope. After everyone had departed, I found Wolfe settled behind his desk with a monograph on the chemistry of volatile compounds. The sealed evidence sachets had been removed to Inspector Kramer's custody, the surveillance vehicles had vanished from the street, and the brownstone had resumed its normal evening tranquility. "Case closed?" I asked. "Case resolved," he corrected. "The contamination will be neutralized, the reputations will be restored, and the perpetrators will face the consequences of their corruption." "And the garlic?" Wolfe allowed himself a small smile. "We'll once again smell of earth and sun and the promise of nourishment as nature intended. Some corruptions, Archie, are temporary. Others, like the moral bankruptcy we witnessed today, leave permanent stains." As Fritz announced that dinner was served, I reflected that our case had concluded with exactly the kind of systematic intellectual satisfaction that made Wolfe's methods superior to conventional investigation. The conspiracy had been exposed through logic rather than luck. The perpetrators had been apprehended through evidence rather than intuition, and justice had been served with the precision of one of Fritz's perfect meals. The garlic no longer smelled of death, but the memory of corruption would linger long enough to serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider poisoning the wells of honest commerce. Some violations, as Wolfe had observed, cannot be forgiven. Today we had demonstrated exactly what that meant, and why challenging the sanctity of good food, and the brownstone that defended it, was the kind of mistake that people remember for the rest of their considerably shortened careers. The brownstone hadn't enjoyed that particular quality of silence in weeks, the deep, settled quiet that comes when walls stop holding their breath and furniture remembers its proper purpose. No surveillance vans cluttered the street, no anonymous deliveries threatened the sanctity of Fritz's kitchen, and no phones rang with the urgent insistence of crisis. By 11 the next morning, even the October air seemed to approve of our restoration to order. The first call came from Lon Cohen at the Gazette, his voice carrying the breathless excitement of a reporter who discovered his local story had national legs. "Archie, you need to see the morning papers. All of them. This Tillinghast Ridge thing is bigger than anyone realized. I found Wolfe in the kitchen, conducting a solemn examination of garlic bulbs from 3 different suppliers, while Fritz prepared what smelled like the kind of breakfast that makes you forgive the world its various shortcomings. The rich, earthy aroma of honest garlic filled the room, a welcome change from the corrupted specimens that had occupied our attention for the past week. The suppliers pass inspection? I asked, settling at Fritz's table with the stack of newspapers that had accumulated like evidence. Exemplary, Wolfe replied, selecting a particularly promising bulb and examining it with the reverence he usually reserved for rare orchids. Ms. Vasquez's relationships have been restored, and the contamination appears to have been completely neutralized. Mr. Brenner confirms that garlic once again smells as nature intended. The newspapers told a more complex story. The Times had buried our case in the business section, but their investigation had uncovered connections between Tillinghast Ridge and similar operations in Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington. The Post had embraced the human interest angle, featuring Elena and Carmen outside the warehouse under a headline that read, "Garlic Wars: How Wall Street Poisoned Main Street." But it was the Wall Street Journal that had found the real story buried in financial filings and corporate structures. Tillinghast Ridge wasn't operating in isolation, I reported, spreading the papers across Fritz's immaculate counter. They're part of a network of private equity funds that have been systematically targeting specialty food businesses throughout the Northeast. Same methods, same objectives, same overseas financing. Wolfe paused in his examination, his dark eyes taking on the expression that meant someone had underestimated the scope of their own corruption. The conspiracy expands beyond our immediate purview. Like ripples in a pond, the Journal estimates that over 40 businesses have been affected in the past 18 months. Restaurant closures, supplier bankruptcies, distribution networks disrupted. Someone has been conducting economic warfare against an entire industry sector. Before Wolfe could respond, Inspector Kramer called with the controlled frustration of a man who'd thought he'd closed a case only to discover he'd opened a federal investigation. "Wolfe, we need to discuss developments. Victoria Ashford made bail this morning, and her attorneys are claiming she was acting under duress from unnamed parties. Says she has information about a larger conspiracy, but will only discuss it in exchange for immunity." "Naturally," Wolfe replied, his tone suggesting he'd expected exactly this development. "Ms. Ashford has discovered that being the visible face of a conspiracy makes one expendable when the operation is exposed. There's more. Vincent Aldrich, the operative your Ms. Rodriguez knew as Vale, was found dead in his cell early this morning. Apparent suicide, but the timing suggests someone wanted to eliminate a potentially cooperative witness." Wolfe's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the Hudson. Mr. Aldrich possessed detailed knowledge of the operation structure, financing, and personnel. His death eliminates a crucial witness and confirms that Ms. Ashford's claims of coercion may have merit. So what's our next move? We demonstrate that some conspiracies are too large to be buried with a single operative. Wolfe moved toward the office with the deliberate pace of a man who decided that thoroughness was more important than expedience. Contact Ms. Ashford's counsel and inform them that we are prepared to discuss her situation. Also, call the editors at the Journal and Times. If they wish to pursue the larger story, we can provide them with additional context. By noon, Elena had called to report that Chez Laurent, the Meridian, and Piccolo Mondo were all requesting meetings to restore their contracts. David says we can certify clean storage within 24 hours. We've scrubbed every surface and replaced every container that showed even a trace of contamination. Her voice carried the cautious optimism of someone who'd learned not to trust good news too quickly. And Carmen is testifying this afternoon. The district attorney's office has been surprisingly understanding about her circumstances. Marcus Chen arrived at 2 o'clock with a contract in one hand, and the expression of a man who discovered that vindication tastes better than revenge. The Meridian wants me back, with a premium surcharge for the inconvenience. I told them their money was tainted, then took it anyway. A man has to keep his balsamic in proper barrels, I observed. He turned serious. Mr. Wolfe, I owe you more than I can repay. Wolfe stopped him with a small gesture. You owe Ms. Vasquez your continued candor and yourself your vigilance. Markets may abhor a vacuum, but they abhor ethics even more. See that yours persist despite the pressure. The afternoon brought Harrison Blackwood, Victoria Ashford's counsel, carrying a briefcase and the careful dignity of a lawyer who discovered his client was drowning in deeper water than anyone had realized. His documents painted a picture of systematic market manipulation that made our garlic case look like a small symptom of a much larger disease. She was recruited by representatives of what she believed was a legitimate investment consortium, Blackwood explained. The true scope of the operation was concealed from her until she was too deeply involved to withdraw safely. She documented her concerns in encrypted files, names, dates, financial transfers, operational directives. The files revealed a coordinated campaign spanning multiple states, targeting dozens of specialty food businesses with methods ranging from contamination to supplier interference to regulatory harassment. Investment funds, shell companies, offshore accounts, and a network of operatives conducting synchronized attacks on independent businesses throughout the region. The financial backing comes from European pension funds and sovereign wealth entities seeking to acquire undervalued American food distribution networks, Blackwood continued. They identified specialty foods as a growth sector with fragmented ownership and minimal regulatory oversight. By evening, federal agents had joined Inspector Kramer in the office, their presence confirming that our case had attracted the attention of people who took economic warfare seriously. The systematic questioning that followed transformed criminal conspiracy from abstract concept to documented reality, with Victoria Ashford providing detailed testimony about a network that extended far beyond our immediate investigation. Preliminary count suggests over 60 businesses affected in the past 2 years. Kramer reported as the federal agents prepared to depart with their evidence. Direct losses in the millions, indirect economic impact in the tens of millions. Your garlic investigation just became a federal matter, Wolfe. After everyone had departed, I found Wolfe in the office, settled behind his desk with the satisfaction of a man who discovered that his intellectual exercise had revealed genuine significance. The sealed evidence bags had been removed to official custody. The surveillance vehicles had vanished from the street, and the brownstone had resumed its normal evening tranquility. Now that the immediate crisis has been resolved, Wolfe said, it may be instructive to examine the precise mechanisms of their criminal methodology, both for our own understanding and for the historical record. He leaned back in his chair with the expression of a professor beginning a particularly important lecture. The method was deceptively elegant, relying on human psychology and sophisticated chemistry in equal measure. Mr. Aldrich possessed specialized knowledge of volatile organic compounds through his mortuary science studies. His employers provided the organizational structure and financial resources necessary to exploit that knowledge systematically. The contamination sachets contained precursor chemicals, thiols and amines, which would react slowly when exposed to warehouse humidity and temperature, producing putrefactive odors that mimicked natural spoilage while being entirely artificial. The process was designed to be gradual, insidious, and difficult to trace. But the true genius of their scheme lay not in the chemistry, but in the psychology. They did not merely destroy product, they destroyed trust. They undermined the very concept of quality assurance, making it impossible for clients to distinguish genuine spoilage from deliberate contamination. This created a climate of fear and suspicion that forced honest businesses into impossible choices. I reflected on the systematic nature of what we'd uncovered. They turned food safety into a weapon. Indeed, and in doing so, they committed an offense not merely against commerce, but against the fundamental principle of nourishment itself. Wolfe's voice carried the weight of absolute moral certainty. They sought to profit from the corruption of sustenance, a violation I find particularly egregious. As Fritz announced that dinner was served, I realized that our case had concluded with exactly the kind of systematic intellectual satisfaction that made Wolfe's methods superior to conventional investigation. We'd started with contaminated garlic and discovered economic warfare. We'd begun with Elena's business problems and uncovered international conspiracy. The garlic no longer smelled of death, but the memory of corruption would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider poisoning the wells of honest commerce. The evening meal was coq au vin, prepared with herbs that definitely didn't smell of death, and the contrast between morning's corrupted samples and evening's honest ingredients seemed to encapsulate everything our investigation had revealed about the difference between authentic commerce and systematic fraud. Case closed? I asked as Fritz served coffee that had been roasted with the precision of a master craftsman. Case resolved, Wolfe corrected. The immediate conspiracy has been exposed, the perpetrators apprehended, and the victims restored to their proper standing. The federal authorities are competent to pursue the larger network. Our obligation was to restore the integrity of honest garlic, and that has been accomplished. And the larger lesson. Wolfe considered the question while examining his coffee with appreciation. That corruption, like contamination, spreads through systems designed for purity, but also that both can be neutralized by sufficient application of knowledge, persistence, and moral clarity. As the brownstone settled into its evening routine, I reflected that some violations truly cannot be forgiven, but some discoveries reveal that the world is both more corrupt and more resilient than anyone wants to admit. The garlic smelled of earth and sun again. Fritz's kitchen had been restored to its proper sanctity, and justice had been served with the precision of a perfect meal. The surveillance vans were gone, the conspirators were in custody, and the brownstone had returned to its proper state of ordered tranquility. Some cases end with explosions, others end with the quiet satisfaction of truth properly served. This one had ended exactly as it should, with the restoration of honest flavor and the defeat of systematic corruption. And that, I reflected as I turned out the office lights, was victory enough for any reasonable man's definition of justice. The brownstone had settled back into its proper rhythm with the deep satisfaction of a well-tuned instrument that had successfully navigated a particularly challenging composition. By the third morning after Victoria Ashford's arrest, the house sounded exactly as it should. The elevator humming up to the plant rooms at 9, Fritz's whisk singing against porcelain in the kitchen, the radiators clicking their discreet warnings to October that indoors remained a separate jurisdiction. I had managed 2 full cups of coffee without a telephone interrupting the ritual, a luxury as rare as it sounds. The morning mail brought confirmation that justice, like good cooking, benefits from patient attention to detail. Federal prosecutors had filed charges against 17 individuals connected to the Tillinghast Ridge conspiracy, including 3 European financiers who discovered that American courts took a distinctly unfavorable view of economic warfare disguised as investment strategy. The investigation had expanded to encompass similar operations in Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, with over 80 businesses identified as targets of systematic market manipulation. Elena arrived at 11 with a banker's envelope and the expression of someone who had walked out of a storm and was still checking the sky for clouds. She placed the envelope on Wolfe's blotter with the reverence due a peace treaty, then settled into the red leather chair with visible relief. "The restaurants are back," she reported, her voice carrying the cautious optimism of someone who'd learned not to trust good news too quickly. Chez Laurent, the Meridian, Piccolo Mondo, all renewed with premium surcharges. David says our reputation is actually stronger now than before the contamination. Wolfe examined her face rather than reaching for the envelope. He prefers his receipts in certainties, not denominations. Your business depends on the restoration of trust, Ms. Vasquez. You will do well to remember how quickly it can be squandered. Carmen is back, Elena continued. She's paying for what she did, but in the right way. The emphasis on right suggested that lawyers and Mercy had found common ground. We talk every night. She's stronger than either of us realized. Wolfe inclined his head with the gravity the information deserved. Ms. Rodriguez will require the same instruction in trust that you do, only longer, but redemption, properly pursued, often produces the most reliable converts to integrity. At 1:30, Marcus Chen called with news that carried the satisfaction of a man who discovered that vindication tastes considerably better than revenge. The Journal wants to do a feature story on market manipulation in specialty foods, he reported. They're calling it The Garlic Wars, and they want to interview Mr. Wolfe about investigative methodology. Mr. Wolfe doesn't grant interviews, I replied, but he might consider a written statement if they can demonstrate sufficient understanding of the underlying principles, which are that corruption spreads through systems designed for purity, but can be neutralized by sufficient application of knowledge, persistence, and moral clarity. The afternoon brought Inspector Kramer with a folder full of developments and the expression of a man whose patience had been comprehensively rewarded. Wolfe, that Tillinghast Ridge investigation has opened up a network that makes our garlic case look like a warm-up exercise. Similar operations in 4 states, systematic targeting of independent food businesses, coordination that required serious organizational backing. He settled into his chair with professional satisfaction. Victoria Ashford's cooperation has been comprehensive. Turns out she documented everything. Financial transfers, operational directives, personnel assignments. The woman kept records of her own conspiracy with the thoroughness of a corporate auditor. Fear breeds thoroughness, Wolfe observed. Ms. Ashford recognized that her survival depended on proving her value to the investigation. More than survival. She's agreed to testify against the European financiers in exchange for a reduced sentence. Says she wants to restore some measure of integrity to legitimate investment practices. Kramer's tone suggested skepticism about this sudden conversion to ethics. At 4 o'clock, an unexpected visitor arrived. Giuseppe Martinelli, the olive oil importer whose business had suffered the same systematic sabotage. He was a man in his 60s, well-dressed but carrying himself with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned not to take prosperity for granted. My grandfather started this business in 1923, he explained, settling into the office with old-world courtesy. 3 generations of honest work, nearly destroyed by people who saw profit in corruption. You saved more than my business, Mr. Wolfe. You saved my family's honor. Wolfe received this testimonial with appropriate gravity. Your family's honor was never in question, Mr. Martinelli. It was merely obscured by systematic deception designed to exploit others' trust in quality. As our visitors prepared to leave, Elena turned back with a question that had obviously been weighing on her mind. Mr. Wolfe, how did you know from the beginning that this was more than simple business sabotage? The systematic nature of the contamination suggested institutional backing rather than individual malice, he replied. The sophistication of the chemistry indicated professional knowledge and resources. Most importantly, the psychological impact, the deliberate destruction of trust itself, revealed an understanding of market dynamics that exceeded mere criminal opportunism. That evening, as Fritz announced dinner with the soft triumph that comes from a kitchen restored to its rightful state, we adjourned to the dining room for what proved to be a celebration disguised as a meal. The consommé was crystalline, the roasted pheasant perfect, in the garlic mashed potatoes, made, I noted with satisfaction, from Elena's certified uncontaminated bulbs, carried the rich, honest aroma that spoke of earth and sun and proper cultivation. After the lemon souffle and coffee, Wolfe leaned back in his chair with the reflective expression that usually preceded his most important observations. The silence in the room was complete, broken only by the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "Archie," he began, his voice carrying the weight of considered judgment, "this entire affair serves as a potent reminder of a fundamental truth. The corruption of the simple, the perversion of the elemental, is often more insidious and ultimately more destructive than any grand larceny or overt violence." He paused, swirling the last drops of coffee in his cup. "To poison the very sustenance by which we live, to transform the promise of flavor into the stench of death, that is a crime of particularly heinous nature. It speaks to a profound moral bankruptcy, a willingness to sacrifice not merely profit, but purity itself, for the sake of avarice. They sought to control the market by destroying its foundation." He continued, believing that no one would notice the rot beneath their gilded facade. But the human palate, Archie, is often a more reliable detector of truth than any financial ledger. And when one attempts to corrupt the very essence of garlic, which in its honest form is a symbol of vitality, of flavor, of life itself, one invites a reckoning that transcends mere legalities. I considered his words, recognizing the philosophy behind them. "So a crime against humanity, then?" Wolfe grunted, a sound that could mean anything from agreement to dismissal. "More precisely, Archie, a crime against appetite, and in my experience, those are the ones that truly require comprehensive correction." As he rose from the table and moved toward his evening reading, I reflected that our case had concluded with exactly the kind of intellectual satisfaction that made his methods superior to conventional investigation. We'd started with Elena's contaminated garlic and discovered an international conspiracy. We'd begun with simple business sabotage and uncovered systematic economic warfare. The immediate crisis had been resolved, the perpetrators apprehended, and the victims restored not merely to solvency, but to prosperity. The brownstone hummed with the satisfaction of order properly maintained. No surveillance vans cluttered the street, no anonymous deliveries threatened Fritz's kitchen, and no phones rang with the urgent insistence of crisis. The garlic smelled of earth and honest labor again. Justice had been served with appropriate precision, and the future promised nothing more dramatic than the daily routine of orchids, meals, and the occasional intellectual challenge worthy of Nero Wolfe's attention. In the end, that was victory enough for any reasonable definition of justice. Some mysteries conclude with explosions. Others end with the quiet satisfaction of truth properly served and authentic flavor properly restored. This one had ended exactly as it should, with the restoration of honest commerce, the defeat of systematic corruption, and the demonstration that some violations of fundamental principles truly cannot be forgiven. The October evening carried the promise of honest seasons ahead, and as I turned out the office lights, I reflected that between the federal prosecutors and Fritz's perfect garlic, the world seemed marginally more civilized than it had a month ago, which, for our little corner of West 35th Street, was about as close to perfection as any reasonable man could expect. Case concluded. Justice served, dinner properly seasoned with uncontaminated ingredients, and Nero Wolfe settled in his chair with a book on botanical chemistry, as immovable and satisfied as the laws of physics themselves. Some things, thankfully, remain constant in an inconstant world.